week 4 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few wide receivers I would bench this week. The first guy's Kenny Golladay of the New York Giants. So far this season, Kenny Golladay, he hasn't done much of anything for fantasy owners. Week 1 versus Denver, 4 catches, 64 yards. Week 2 at Washington, 3 catches, 38 yards. And in a plus matchup last week versus Atlanta, 4 catches, 64 yards. So right here, week 4 at New Orleans, it's a middle-of-the-pack matchup. The Saints give up the 13 least fantasy points to wide receivers. But right here, Kenny Golladay, he's pretty much only maxing out at a few catches for 60 yards this season. And this Giant team, they just can't punch the ball in as well in the red zone. So this week, I don't like a lot of Giants in this matchup versus New Orleans. After we saw them in New Orleans, week 1 shut down Aaron Rodgers, and then in week 3 shut down Mac Jones. So in this ball game, I think it's going to be a struggle for the Giants to score. And Kenny Golladay, he's already banged up once again now with a hip injury that's flared up, and he's been limited in practice the first 2 days of the week. So right here, Kenny Golladay, I just can't trust him. And if you're in a desperate situation, play him, but I'm not expecting much, so I'm going to bench him this week. The next wide receiver I would bench this week is Devonta Smith, Philadelphia Eagles. So Devonta Smith, Heisman Trophy winner last season. So far, he's off to a pretty slow start this year. Week 1 in Atlanta, he had a good game, 6 catches, 71 yards, and a touchdown. But the last 2 weeks, he's done nothing. Week 2 versus San Francisco, 2 catches, 16 yards. And week 3 at the Dallas Cowboys, 3 catches, 28 yards. And this week here, week 4, I know the Eagles, they're probably going to be trailing early and often in this one with Jalen Hurts, and this team's going to have to throw the ball versus the Kansas City Chiefs. But right here with those 2 bad ball games in week 2 and 3, I can't trust Devonta Smith. He's a rookie. He's still got to learn the playbook maybe and know how to run the full route tree. And right now, he's just a guy I can't trust, so I would bench him this week. The next wide receiver I would bench this week's Hollywood Brown. So Brown last week, he dropped 2 long balls that would have been touchdowns for this Baltimore Raven team. And then he dropped another one later on in the game that would have been a big game. So Brown, a lot of drop passes, 3 big ones last week. And the first 2 weeks of the season, he was off to a hot start. Week 1 at the Raiders, 6 catches, 69 yards and a touchdown. Week 2 versus the Chiefs, 6 catches, 113 yards and a touchdown. And week 3 at Detroit, if he catches those 2 or 3 balls, he does have a big ball game. But then after that, he got into the doghouse, and they put him on the bench. And here in week 4, a pretty tough matchup versus the Denver Broncos that give up the 9th least fantasy points to wide receivers this season. So right here, he's in the doghouse a little with those drop passes. Lamar Jackson was looking more of Mark Andrews and Sammy Watkins' way towards the end of that game. And Bateman's off the injured reserve list as well. So this week, after a poor game and drop problems in week 3, I'm going to shy away from Hollywood Brown and see if the Ravens put trust back into him this week before playing him. The next wide receiver is Allen Robinson of the Chicago Bears. So Robinson, he was a 2nd, 3rd round pick in most fantasy drafts coming into the season, but so far he hasn't done nothing for the Bears of fantasy owners. Week 1 at the Rams, 6 catches, 35 yards. Week 2 versus the Bengals, 2 catches, 24 yards. And a touchdown that saved this fantasy day. In week 3 at the Cleveland Browns, they just couldn't do anything on offense. 2 catches, 27 yards. And here week 4 versus the Detroit Lions, I know they're not the greatest of defenses, but Justin Fields, he just can't get that ball down the field so far. And Allen Robinson's been inconsistent this year after going off last season. So this year might just be a down year for him. And it's definitely a downgrade, in my opinion, at quarterback with Fields and Andy Dalton, or even over Mitchell Trubisky from last season. So right here, Robinson, he's been struggling, and I can't start him this week until he breaks out and gets going. In the 5th and final wide receiver, I would bench this week's Amari Cooper of the Dallas Cowboys. I mentioned to bench Cooper last week, and I was right about that. He only had 3 catches for 26 yards. A lot of CeeDee Lamb we saw in that game, a lot of Dalton Schultz, and even Cedric Wilson scored a touchdown in that ball game for the Dallas Cowboys, and Zeke had a decent receiving game. So right here in week 4, another tough matchup for Cooper versus the Carolina Panthers that give up the 6th least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers. And the other thing with Cooper here, he's just not 100% with the rib injury since week 1 after he took a hit in the end zone in that ball game. He's 139 yards and 2 touchdowns. In week 2 with the Chargers, only 3 catches, 24 yards. And week 3, like I mentioned, versus Philly, 3 catches, 26 yards. So right here, Dak Prescott, he has many options in this offense. It's not just some matchups here for wide receivers with Cooper, Carolina. So right here, he's a player I would bench this week. So that's a few wide receivers I would bench in week 4 of the fantasy football season.